Hi, my name is Soundarya and I'm the creator of Unshackled Club. Welcome to an edition in the Extraordinary Visa Library, where we bring in past recipients of O1, EB1, and EB2 NIW visas to understand their journey and demystify the process to help more talented immigrants like you get these visas. In this edition, we have Awais Hussain. Originally from the United Kingdom, Awais moved to the US in 2011 to pursue his bachelor's in physics and philosophy at Harvard University. Unlike other students, though, he left the US to go back to UK, but then several years later, he re-entered the US on an L-1B through the company that he was working for, Wave. After working at Wave for a few more years, he decided to start his own company and got an O-1A approved through that in late 2022. Awais Hussain, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive in. Awais, thank you so much for being with me. And I always like to kick off this discussion with the question of what motivated you to look into the O1 as a founder? Because it's not a very common visa like the H1B.
Yeah, absolutely. So I already had like a decent connection to the US, I would say, like through coming to the US for university, and then I had kind of come back to the US on an L1B. And the main reason for coming to the US is I just feel like if you're a tech person like, doing software engineering, then the US is the place to be. And after I had been in the US for a few years, I kind of had this ambition to start my own company, but didn't want to jeopardize my status in the US as a result of that, because obviously the L1B is tied to one specific employer and you can't like self-petition or transfer. So then I spoke to an immigration lawyer and he basically advised me that the EB2 NIW would be the best option. And so we prepared an application for that. It was a little bit scary because my L1B was expiring in about a year. And so like I needed to get the EB2 done and like get my employment authorization done like before that timeline expired. But just like a lot went wrong in that process. Like as far as we could tell, like USCIS never received the application, and like me and my lawyer tried following up in numerous different ways and just like could not get in contact with them to figure out if they had even received it. Um, and so then essentially as an emergency measure almost, my immigration lawyer suggested applying for an O1 because he felt like I had a good application and that would at least buy me 3 years of time to continue working on my startup and then potentially go for like a green card at some point in the future.
Okay, wow. And in this case, the NIW application, were you planning to apply for this through your own company or were you applying through Wave, which was the company you were working for?
Initially it was through Wave, I believe, or I think it was like self-petitioned, um, if I'm
Gotcha,
correct.
gotcha.
Yeah.
And when did you, when did it become, because it sounds like you filed the NIW and then it wasn't even received. Some mishap happened there. At what point did you realize that, okay, I have to figure something else out? Because it's, I realized with the O1 that there is a certain moment in an immigrant's journey when it feels like this is urgent right now. I have to get my visa. Did you
Mhm.
ever have that urgency in yours?
Yeah, I had like two sources of urgency, I guess. So one was that my L1B was expiring kind of February of 2023. So the timeline is I like started conversations with my immigration lawyer like October of 2021, I would say. And then we filed the application in January of 2022. So with about a year to hear back. Um, and then it had been like several months and we hadn't heard anything. And then in November of that year, November of 2022, I wanted to go back to the UK for like a cousin's wedding, and I really didn't want to miss that. And so I had been having conversations with my immigration lawyer and saying like, please, can you help me figure out what I can do so that I can leave the US for November? Um, and so yeah, then like I think in mid-September was when he proposed applying for the O1 since we like, just hadn't heard anything about the EB2. And then that process was like we kind of got the documents together in a few weeks and like applied via premium processing, and like the application was approved in 2 weeks in like the end of October.
That is insane. A lot of people spend years in their own application, myself included. So I guess yeah, we'll jump into how you did that in just a few weeks. So in terms of the O1 application, I'm curious, when did you come across the O1 as a visa pathway for the first time, and when you realized that I'm going to pursue the O1 route, what was the very first step you took?
So it mostly came from my immigration lawyer. So he was obviously like aware of the entire situation, and he was the one who initially proposed the O1 as a solution to this kind of like slow NIW process. And then I think I was somewhat fortunate in the sense that I like already had a lot of the evidence and I didn't need to go out and judge competitions or like do extra things because I had already fundraised around $100,000 for the startup I was working on. I already had the L1B, which had to demonstrate specialized knowledge. And so like some of those projects were reusable. Um, and then yeah, like I feel like I didn't have to go out and achieve like extra things. It was all from stuff we already had. So it was just a case of gathering those and packaging them. Um, yeah.
Jumping into your O1 application, so your top three criteria were awards, high salary, and critical capacity. So I'd love to
Mhm.
go like one by one in all of this. Let's start with awards. So what evidence did you present for the awards category?
So the main thing was the fundraising, the money that we had raised, and this was interesting to me because I didn't know. Like I think I had read the O1 criteria before and assumed like I don't really have any eligible awards. But my immigration lawyer made me aware that if you have raised money, even if it's from friends and family, as long as those people can make a case for being judicious investors, then that can count as an award in the eyes of USCIS. So like some of the friends and family who invested had also invested in lots of other startups, or like one of the people who wrote a recommendation letter, for example, was like an investor more broadly, and so could point to yeah, his like discernment in making this investment.
And was that it? You showed a bunch of letters that state that this is how much I invested in
Mhm.
Awais' company.
Yeah. So yeah, we had all of the safes that were signed, and then like evidence
Uh-huh.
that people had invested, and then two people we had like write specific like prose letters. Um,
Wow. Did your lawyer back then think $100,000 was good enough for the awards category?
yeah, it was interesting. Like I also assumed that it maybe wouldn't be enough, but he basically said that there's no like lower limit or there's no strict amount that USCIS declares. So like yeah, it doesn't need to be that much, I guess.
That's great because even in my case, I included a grant for $50,000 from a organization in the application. I didn't think that would be enough, but once again, I also think you don't know which categories they actually approve if they approve your
Mhm.
application. They don't tell you that. But this is very helpful to know for someone else who might have raised $100,000 and think it's not enough maybe.
Mhm.
Um, so that's it for awards. What about next? High salary. So what did you include for that?
So the high salary one was interesting, and I think I like benefited quite a lot from like the frothy tech market of 2021. So I essentially had like my like base salary, and then I had also been gifted or like granted a lot of stock options in Wave, which like in the time I was there, they raised money at like a $1.7 billion valuation, and so like my stock options ended up being worth quite a lot. And I think yeah, like once you add up like the cash comp plus the stock ended up being quite a lot.
Gotcha. Um, and I guess that's all you need because high salary is one of the more straightforward, objective criteria out there. You just have to show you're in the top 10th percentile. Um, but I'm curious
Mhm.
how you showed you were in the top 10th percentile specifically.
So we submitted like pay stubs from that whole year. We submitted like the stock certificates that had been given and like the Carta like vesting grants and those agreements. And then my lawyer also did kind of like a mini research thing where he found like average salary of a software engineer in New York City and then included that in the application as well. And basically like benchmarked against that.
Okay, gotcha. Awesome. And coming to the last one, which is critical capacity. So, critical capacity is about showing that you play a critical role in an organization that is also distinguished. So, there's like a
Mhm.
twofold criteria under this. Um, what did you do for that?
Yeah, so that one was interesting. My lawyer basically like submitted evidence both from like the new company path that I had formed, and that was essentially sending like the articles of incorporation, demonstrating that I was like a director and a board member, and which I guess makes sense because I had founded the company and it was still very new. Um, and then for Wave, we basically had letters from like the founder of Wave and also from my manager describing some of the work I had done. And then for the distinguished like organization, Wave had a lot of evidence because they had done this big fundraise, and so there were like articles in Bloomberg and like an analyst at Founders Fund had written like a really long blog post about Wave and how it was changing the world, or like changing the finance industry in Africa.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I was also reading about Wave, and they've raised $200 million of or that's something on that line. So that's, at that point, I don't think there is any doubt that the organization is distinguished. But I'm curious how you specifically showed that you played a critical role, because I'm assuming Wave has 1,000 employees when you were there.
Yeah, but so I joined in 2018 and I was like the third engineer at Wave and was basically like living in a
Uh,
house with the founders. And so like we used
gotcha.
a lot of the kind of like initial technology that Wave like pioneered. Like I got to work on in the early days when like we had very few resources, and so like everyone was working on everything basically. And it was really only in like late like 2021, 2022 when Wave really started like growing really quickly. Um,
Okay. I didn't know that. Wow. So when you joined, Wave was a 10% something like that company? Or
it was maybe like 40 people. And it
gotcha.
was also like kind of a complicated corporate structure because the founders had already built like a successful company before. So they had built a company called Sendwave, which does international remittances. And then essentially they had like pivoted towards doing domestic mobile money, which was just like sending money mostly like Senegal to Senegal. And so I was like very early in the new business, but like the founders and some of the team had already had this like pretty extensive experience in the fintech world in Africa.
Okay, okay, okay. That makes sense. So the 40 people kind of came from the previous company, most of them, it sounds like, which
Yeah,
means you were
some
still
of them,
playing.
and yeah, and it was like some of them were from the previous company, and a lot of them were kind of like in operational roles in Africa. So like kind of support team, and yeah, just like building a fintech business in Africa requires a lot of on the ground work. Like there's yeah, it's like a very operationally heavy business. So we had quite a few. Like we had a larger footprint than you might
Wow.
expect for a typical tech company.
Right. I mean, out of curiosity, I'm just curious, what made you join Wave at that point? And you stayed there for 4.5 or almost 5 years, right?
Just about 4 years actually.
4 years. Yeah, what made you join the company? Because it sounds like it was very small and early on when you joined it.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I guess that goes back a few years now. But so I had been to Harvard for my undergrad, and kind of as I was graduating, I was looking around at the opportunities available, and like a lot of my friends were going into finance and consulting, and I just like looked around and didn't see anything that really like caught my attention, and was like, okay, this is going to improve the world in a meaningful way. So I actually like went backpacking around India for like a year and a half. So I had like a grant from Harvard, which allowed me to just travel and explore in this like very free form way. Almost like a Fulbright fellowship, but it wasn't a Fulbright, it was something different. And I think like that experience of just having a backpack and having to like figure out what I was going to do and like explore according to what I was curious about, um, gave me a sense that I could like survive almost anywhere. And then once I got back to London, like learned about the kind of software engineering world there, I was looking for something bigger and was like trying to be more ambitious. So I just like reached out to lots of people in my network, and like one of the smartest people I knew in college was working at Wave. And he was like a very early employee there, and like went on to become my manager and like the CTO of Wave. And in my head, I was like, okay, if this person's working at Wave, they must be doing something right. And so I got curious, and yeah, like they interviewed me, and I just thought it was like a really great team, and they were working on a super important problem. Because like in Africa, like there are hundreds of millions of people who don't have a bank account at all, which just like I think in the West we sometimes take that for granted and can't really imagine what it's like, but it means that, it's like much harder to save money. It's much harder to just like keep your money safe. It's like much harder to build a business like Amazon, which like needs to take payments up front and then do deliveries, like that kind of thing. So yeah, that was like, and it was a really great experience for me and my career, I would say, just to see the company start off so small, like almost pre-product market fit, and then like see that it could grow into something. And like now Wave is like the biggest mobile money provider in Senegal and has like a huge market share in Cote d'Ivoire. And yeah, is like a very serious business. I think it's like one of the top 50 YC companies, and has had a lot of success.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know it was also a YC company. Um, well, this is definitely off topic, but because you mentioned India, and a lot of people um, who are watching this, I'm assuming are also from India. What made you visit India specifically?
Um, yeah, I was mostly just curious, I would say. Like I felt like so I'd grown up in the UK and then I had gone over to the US, which was like kind of a big culture shock. The UK and the US are very similar in many ways, but there are also just like big differences. And I guess I was like I wanted to broaden my perspectives and just like learn more about the broader world, not just like the kind of elite institutions that I had been in. And so like my parents are from Pakistan, so I can speak some like Urdu and Hindi. So I thought India would be a good place to go just to see like completely different way of living, but where I still have some access to the place because of the language.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering all of that. Before we jump to the final kind of section of the podcast, I want to talk about recommendation letters. So you said you got four recommendation letters for your application. Um, how did you go about choosing who to get these letters from? Any decision framework that you were going through while choosing these people?
So the recommendation letters I think were like relatively simple for me as compared to like some of the other applications I've heard about, or especially I feel like I've seen lots of people who have had like green card applications and are like getting recommendation letters from like very senior people or people who manage like huge funds or that kind of thing. For me, it was like essentially two letters were from people who had invested in our company. And we just needed to show that they kind of knew what they were doing in making this investment. So people who had like angel invested in other companies, or like the person I mentioned before who was like an investor by profession, not in startups, but in kind of securities more broadly. So it was like those two people, which was relatively obvious. And then for like the critical capacity and like wave stuff, it was like the same two people who had written reference letters for my L1B application. So this was like my manager and one of the co-founders of Wave. Oh, one other thing I'll just mention is like I think when it came to recommendation letters, I assumed that it would be like quite different. Like I assumed I would have to email people and then follow up and like they would take a long time. But I found that everyone I contacted just like got back to me within a day and like was very willing to sign and like, you know, kind of like I feel like there are a lot of people who appreciate that the US immigration process is so complicated and challenging and like they don't want to be the person blocking it. And I felt like the reception was really positive when I was asking for recommendation letters. So this may be like a small tip to anyone who's applying and like worried about contacting people.
Right. Okay, gotcha. And it sounds like, your O1 timeline was so short because largely because of the L1B application as well. Aside the fact that, you were also this critical part of this incredibly huge company. So it'll be helpful maybe to briefly talk about the L1B application as well, given how it helped your O1.
Yeah.
Can you maybe talk about why you chose the L1B as the route to specifically come back and what did you have to submit for that?
Yeah, so the L1B, so I think my situation was kind of interesting because like when I graduated from college, I just like had no real desire to stay in the US, which I think is a little like I almost feel like I was underinformed about how challenging US immigration can be, or I just like I didn't think that my career was going to be in the US, so I didn't even apply for OPT or like kind of look at potential ways of remaining in the US. I like was really excited to go travel around India. And then it was only, I guess, a few years later when I started my like career as a software engineer, where I just felt like US companies were, I don't know, like a little bit above what I was finding in the UK in terms of like the kinds of opportunities available. And so then it became a priority for me to get back into the US. And I was quite fortunate that I was working at Wave, because Wave was like American founders, registered in Delaware, had like a big US and like entity, and then they also had entities around the world. So I was hired by Wave's UK entity. Um, and yeah, I don't actually remember how I learned about the L1B, but I do remember like learning about it and realizing like, oh, this is so much simpler than the H1B. Like there's no lottery process. It's not like one day a year where you can apply. You basically just have to be working at a company for a year. And then once you meet that criteria and can demonstrate specialized knowledge, um, then it's like, yeah, there's a lot less uncertainty involved in applying.
Yeah, I think maybe one like caveat of the L1 that just so people know is that you can switch companies on the L1B. You have to
Yeah.
stick to the company that is bringing you into the US under their wing. Um, but it seems like that wasn't a problem for you because you kind of you did want to continue working for Wave for the
Yeah.
next few years, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I stayed, yeah, like I think my L1B was done in 2019 and I stayed at Wave until 2022. So like I
Right.
mean I think it's arguably like I wonder how much companies think about like immigration as an incentive program. Like I do think I maybe like stayed at Wave longer, or like was really happy to stay at Wave because I was like appreciative that they had like sponsored my visa and like enabled me to live and work in the US.
Right. And for the L1B, so L1B is for specialized knowledge, L1A is for executives and managers. In your case, how did you portray the specialized knowledge? Since you'd been working for Wave only for a year at that point, and I'm assuming it wasn't a very big entity back then, as it is right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we had like kind of the early signs of product market fit, but nowhere near the same like success that we've had later on. So we essentially focused on like two of the projects that I had worked on, which were essentially like proprietary code effectively. So I think I can talk about these because they're like relatively far in the past, but one was essentially like allowing Wave to accept like offline payments, which was like how does Wave accept payments in situations where like the internet connection is not as reliable as you might expect? And that was something that like not many other companies had done, and was like unique to Wave. And so it was possible. It was essentially like making the argument that the code that I had written for this project was like proprietary and unique to Wave, and like not just like something that anyone else would be capable of doing.
Gotcha. And you showed this through letters from the found, uh, or something else.
That was included in the letters, and then also just like code samples and like design docs. We
Wow.
submitted quite a lot of kind of like internal company paperwork,
Uh-huh.
like just like describing what the projects were and their impact, and like almost like the things that we would be doing anyway within the company to track the effectiveness of the project. Um, yeah, we like sent those to USCIS.
Got it. Awesome. So, I mean, this is, you're certainly one of the fastest O1s as much as anyone that I've heard of. Just because you
Okay.
started the process September 2022, you got it in October 2022. But it does sound like you've done some background work several years ago, thanks to the
Mhm.
L1. Um, you know, talking about the last section of the podcast, I think one of the topics that goes unheard of generally in an immigrant's high-skilled immigrant's journey is the emotional tax that people pay when
Mhm.
they like come to this country as an immigrant. Um, so I know you faced some challenges with the EB2 NIW, which was probably stressful, I'm assuming. I'm curious um, what were the emotional challenges you faced since you've come to this country about 4 years ago? Any moments that, I don't know, come out to you from the last 4 years?
Um, Yeah, I mean some big ones. So like one thing we didn't really talk about was like my second L1B. So I actually have had two different L1Bs, and the reason for that was I got the first one in 2019, then COVID hit, and I like went back to London because it didn't seem like New York was the place to be while COVID was happening. And in that time period, Wave went through kind of a bunch of corporate restructurings, which meant that like the entity that sponsored my L1B no longer existed and like a different entity existed, which was like so strange to me because it like my job was exactly the same and like nothing had really changed about my work. But according to USCIS, like I had to file like a whole new L1B petition. And so that was done during COVID, and there was like no way for me to get an appointment at the consulate in London. Um, this would have been like September 2021, I think.
Mm.
And I like really wanted to, oh, actually, so yeah, September 21, I had like received my approval notice for the new L1B, but I needed to get the stamp in my passport, and just like couldn't find any consular appointments anywhere, and looked into like going to Berlin or Frankfurt or like Copenhagen, and like no one was accepting third country nationals. And so I ended up having to fly to Doha from London basically and like do my consular interview there in order to get my L1B stamp and then fly from there to the US. So that was just like a very wild process where
Yeah.
I mean it was because of COVID, so it was like unique circumstances, but it felt kind of high risk, and I wasn't even sure if they would approve my application in Qatar, so I had to like kind of go hoping that it would work out okay, and unfortunately it did. And then yeah, like the
Yeah.
second piece I think was like when like transitioning from the L1 to the EB2, just like I was kind of very keen to get started on this new company because like I think as a founder you have to be energetic and like want to move quickly. And so like many of my friends advise like, just wait until all of this is done and then start a company. Like don't try and do it now until you like have got the green card and it's like guaranteed. But I did like a risk reward calculus thing and was like, okay, I think like I feel confident enough that it's worth like leaving Wave and starting this company like while the EB2 application is in progress. And once it started falling apart, then I was like, okay, maybe I just made the wrong decision and maybe I like will have to leave and I should have just like taken the safer option. Um, so yeah, I was very happy once like the O1 was approved and like that became an option because now I feel like I'm in a really good place where like the entity that is sponsoring my visa is like the company that I founded that I like have a decent level of control over. Like I like my employer doesn't have as much influence over what I do from an immigration standpoint. But yeah, I
Right.
think this. Oh
Because
yeah, sorry.
the employer is essentially, I'm assuming you and your co-founder, right? You guys were the ones
Yeah,
who founded the company. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, gosh. And the L1B story is so interesting and also insane because you were doing exactly the same job at the same company, but the company had dissolved and become a new company. So essentially from the government side, you were out of status because of that.
Mhm.
Um, so in these, you had your share of, let's just say like emotional tax that you've paid. I'm curious, what helped you going through all of these different micro challenges?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it was just like generally stressful, some periods more than others. And it's like kind of like anything difficult in life, I would say, like friends, family, like people around. Um, and just yeah, trying to make the best like risk adjusted decision where I'm saying like, okay, if if this all goes really badly, like will I feel okay about having taken the risk? And I think in all of these situations, like the answer was yes. Like if I did have to leave the US, then at least I could say like, well, I tried my best and I like got to start this company, maybe a few years earlier than I otherwise would have been able to.
Right. But it also sounds like,
Mm.
your risk appetite is maybe slightly higher than someone else's because you traveled for a year in India.
Mhm.
You weren't a typical someone who, became a software engineer right out of college kind of story. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure that helped as well. Um, Last two questions. So, what did you think was missing during this process? What I mean is, a lot of people say that what was missing is that access to good quality resources when they went
Mhm.
through the O1 process or EB1 process. I know in your case, the O1 process was not as prolonged or strenuous, but for the others, did you feel like I wish this was there when you were going through it?
Um, yeah, I think it's definitely access to like resources or information, but maybe not so much like generic general resources, which I think are like widely available, but like something that can kind of cut through the noise and say like this is what applies to your specific situation, which is obviously difficult to do because that's like legal advice and only immigration lawyers are allowed to do that. But I felt like there was a lot of time where I was reading things and was not sure if it applied to me or didn't. Um, so yeah, and I mean, oh, actually, one other story I have that I did not mention was my F1, like going way back to when I was like a 17 or 18-year-old, which so basically like I showed up at the embassy for my like F1 visa appointment, and I was actually there with another student who was about to join Harvard. And like his visa was approved in 5 days, and my visa went through administrative processing, which basically meant like this will take an indefinitely long period of time. We can't tell you how long it will take, and it ended up taking like 6 months almost. So I basically had to like take a forced gap year. So I started university a year later than I had originally planned
What?
to because of, and I, to this day I still don't know what the reason was because I had like submitted all of the paperwork
Right.
to the best of my ability, and like I had like contacted lawyers at Harvard and had been like, please, can you help me speed this up? And no one had any ability to get involved because it was like a USCIS process. Um,
That's
so,
insane. Oh my God.
so
And
yeah, like that
that's
happens too.
yeah, I mean that's a very straightforward visa as well, F1. You got into Harvard. It's not a no-name university. Everyone knows it.
Yeah.
You had all the documents. I actually didn't know it can take that because my F1 was very straightforward in India. You just
Mhm.
go up for the interview, they give you the visa. But wow,
Yeah. So
but I
I
guess
don't know
that's so
exactly what
long,
happened.
right?
So,
Um, well, last question I'd like to ask you, Wes, is if given another chance, think from 2011, since the moment you entered the US, is there anything you would have done differently from an immigration standpoint?
um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess like maybe I would have paid more attention at like senior year of college and had have thought a bit more about like how badly do I want to stay in the US? Maybe I should just like try to stay in the US no matter what. But like at the time I wasn't really thinking like that, so it's kind of hard to go back and do things differently. More recently, I would say like the whole EB2 process made me realize just how little I knew about the immigration process. Like I had kind of trusted my immigration lawyer to take care of it. Like I was paying him a lot of money. He was like well recommended. I like felt like he was very competent. But when things started going wrong, like I couldn't correctly evaluate if this was like normal procedure and this just happens, or if this was like something where I should be stepping in and like, hitting the red button and trying to like do whatever I could to move things along. And so it felt like, yeah, like if like possibly there were things I could have done in like February of 2022 that would have led to me having a green card right now instead of a O-1. Um, and yeah, I think I could have just been a bit more like proactive in that situation.
Yeah, I mean it's incredibly hard though. As someone who's worked
Mm.
with several lawyers, I know that it's very hard to know when is the right time to step in and overtake your lawyer and take more
Mm.
agency in the process because you you are paying them money so they can do this for you. So
Right.
I, but yeah, that's I'm sorry it happened with you, but I think it's more common than you'd think. Also happened with me in one of my earlier cases. So
Right. And I also
um
just think it's so complicated. Like I feel like there are some like USCIS lockboxes. Like I have no idea if this is something I really need to understand deeply or if it's like completely irrelevant, or like all the different like USCIS processing centers and like their different ways of approaching things and like different timelines. Like I feel like it can be quite difficult. Like I felt like my lawyer was just a black box at times, and like sometimes he would come back with stuff that was really good and positive, and then sometimes I like wouldn't hear back from him and didn't know if I should be worried or not. So yeah, I agree that it's very challenging to know when to
yeah.
step in and when to step back.
Well, do you plan to file an EB-1A at some point in the future?
Maybe we'll see. Yeah, like right now I'm still kind of just like working on my startup. I still have 2 more years on the O1, which can be extended. So I feel like I'm in a relatively secure place at the moment, but yeah, I would like to file like once I kind of have a good plan going forward and feel like I have a compelling case.
Awesome. Well, all the very best. And once again, thanks so much. You're the first someone from UK who's on this, visa library, and really glad that you reached out to me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi again. Thank you so much for watching that. If you're not part of the Unshackled community yet, check unshackled.club to join hundreds of extraordinary immigrants and get access to free consults with lawyers, weekly events and masterclasses, a resource hub, discussion forums, and most of all, a roadmap to reach your goal. Thank you.